Congress certainly wasn't in the plans for me. And I think, this Cicilline's decision to step down was a surprise to so many. But when he did, I had, friends, leaders throughout Rhode Island, met a few in DC, who serve in Congress now, both sides of the aisle, both houses, both parties. Say, hey, you should really consider it. I can consider running for Congress. And my initial reaction to everybody is, how about run from Congress? Because of how polarizing and how petty politics are today. And I thought more about it, and I'm like, this is, I think about my kids and how many of our kids actually want to grow up wanting to be public servants, right? I mean, only 11% of Americans actually trust in government and trust in Congress. And an opportunity like this to serve the American people and to serve Rhode Islanders doesn't come around. It's a once in a generational, because of how blue the district is. And so, spending the time to really expand and talk to as many folks across the district as possible. And the more I spoke with, the more I realized, people are really hungry for change, hungry for someone who's different, someone who can lead and deliver results. And then the next important part is talking to the family and getting them on board. And then we put together a great team and kicked off mid-April. And I had to resign from 15 years of federal service, without a paycheck, without personal wealth, without political connections, without PAC money, super PAC money, any of the dark money that's funneling a lot of these campaigns today. Because I fundamentally believe I have an obligation to continue serving, this country and community I love. And it was one of the hardest decisions, and I know there's a lot of risk involved, but to me, there's no greater reward than serving. I mean, that's what I've done my entire career, and that spirit of service I learned from my grandfather, who was a immigrant, immigrated from Italy to America in search of opportunity, used that opportunity to serve in the Navy during World War II, and then opened up our family neighborhood restaurant, and that spirit of service, after 9/11. I joined the Navy, which took me to Rhode Island almost 20 years ago. As an enlisted sailor, without much money in my pocket, without political connections, just kind of that idea that, I could play a small part in helping build a stronger Rhode Island and a stronger America. And, serving as an enlisted sailor, you're not making much money, enough to, and living on base, enough to put, food on the table. So I worked full time at night, which is bartending downtown Newport, which is where I met my wife, and and then while going to school full time, getting my master's over at Salve. And then once I finished that up, I earned a commission as an intel officer. Spent 4 years on active duty, 6 in the reserves, and then I landed a job as a civilian faculty member at the federal level at the Naval War College, which is where I've been the last 15 years. Bringing, not only educating our nation's leaders, but bringing leaders from across our government, so across the military, the interagency, our intelligence community, members of Congress, even our allies and partners from over 77 countries, together to identify problems and threats to our country that come from space, cyber, every domain, but also practical ways that we can solve those problems by working together. And then that, both against, threats against authoritarian governments, but also threats of climate change. And it was my work on climate change that brought me down to the State Department for a year, working for Secretary John Kerry under President Obama, where we spearheaded new climate change policies on behalf, or during the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which we had for 2 years. And then that work took me back to the War College, where I teamed up with a friend of mine and we created the first multinational, multidisciplinary, multi-year research program that brings together leaders from across the world, both at high levels of government, but also academic leaders, to come to consensus on practical ways that nations and their naval forces can prevent conflict as a result of climate change. And that 4 years of work had a couple of different reports and a draft agreement, and then last fall that capstone project, which we finished off as a book that we published last fall. And I'm really proud of that work because it's a multi-year, like a legislative process. It's bringing people together, lots of dialogue, and nothing happens overnight. So, little small wins, and eventually you folks can come to consensus and publish something that has meat and that's meaningful. And those principles have actually been integrated into the national policies and strategies of many countries, including our own, which led me down to the Pentagon during COVID, which is the Secretary of the Navy said, hey, this is some great work. Can you help spearhead the Department of the Navy's first strategy for the Arctic region to help the Navy and Marine Corps chart a new vision, a new course for the Arctic? And I said, I'd be honored. And that was really a great experience because, you can bring leaders across the Navy and Department of Defense, across our government together from the deck plate level to the 4-star level, to come to consensus on what should be our strategy as a country and as a Navy and Marine Corps team moving forward. And then I returned back to the college, and for the last 3 years, 2.5 years, been focused on the Russia problem set and everything going on with the war in Ukraine. And and all of our war games and research projects, with the exception of the climate change related ones, are all done at the highest classification levels. Mm-hmm. So you have an opportunity to bring in real world leaders who are making the decisions, take the real world plans off the shelf, examine those, understand the issues, where are we strong, where are we weak, where might we succeed, where might we not, all in an effort to make sure that, and at the end of the day, this war that we're in now, that Ukraine is in now, doesn't spill over and doesn't get the U.S. Involved more than we should, and doesn't trip Article 5, which would provoke us and our allies to be directly involved in this. And that's something that we're doing everything that we can over the last couple of years to avoid. So professionally, that's kind of been my journey up to this point.
How long in the Navy? Actually,
10 years, 4 active, 6 reserve.
And retired
as a lieutenant.
Yeah.
So started enlisted and then finished up as an officer.
Started right here locally.
Yeah. So I went to boot camp in Chicago, and then the Newport 18 years ago was my first duty station. And then through whether it's a State Department, Pentagon, just been traveling. This has always been home. This is where we've raised our family, and I would just like you would do in Congress. Like I did at the Pentagon and at the State Department, Tuesday through Thursday, I'm there, and Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, I'm back home.
Right.
Which that's none of it would be possible without my wife, who's incredible. Being able to manage, a full-time working mom, a GM of a restaurant with two young kids, 11 and 9. So it's hard. It's a sacrifice, not only for me in terms of our job, but for everyone, for the whole family.
Is she at that family restaurant your parents started?
No, she manages the surf club downtown Newport.
What was the family restaurant, or is?
It was called Walters.
Walters.
It's still there. It's actually, my grandfather opened it in New York, and then decided to retire, went down, and he moved down to Miami at the time, in their mid-70s, was really segregated, and to a certain extent it still is. And he said, because growing up, working in the kitchen in the Navy with everyone, all walks of life, he said, I got to do something. I got to continue serving. So he opened our family neighborhood restaurant right in the middle of US 1, which separated, the west side was all black and the east side was all white. And he's like, I'm going to do this to bring people together. And that's what he did. And it's just working in that environment, being able to bring people together, where everyone has a seat at the table and a story to share. And growing up in that environment really teaches you hard work, discipline, and what it means to start and grow a small business, which is super hard these days. And that's why my number one focus in this whole, in Congress, would be, is on strengthening, building a strong middle class and a stronger middle class, and lowering costs for hardworking Rhode Islanders, and growing and providing Rhode Islanders an opportunity to grow and start their own small businesses is huge, and it's going to be a big part of my focus.
So you've mentioned that as your priority, at least you did you have today and in the Roger Williams debate. Mm-hmm. So what do you think you as part of Congress could actually do? It's a great thing to say.
Sure.
What do you do?
There's so much that goes into it, because I think, number one, I think, I know inflation's down, but it's not where it should be. So I think part of it is tackling inflation and, fighting off the corporate price gouging. And number two is, providing Rhode Islanders equal opportunity to have access to capital so that they can start, grow, and leverage their own small businesses. The third piece is, I can't tell you how many small businesses I talk to that it's the red tape, whether from Woonsocket down to Jamestown. It's just, it's hard to do this, it's hard to do that. It's just, and it doesn't need to be that hard. I mean, if we really want to grow our businesses, and another big thing, and it's been a problem for decades, and if we really want to strengthen our middle class, if we really want to grow our economy, then, equal pay for equal work. I mean, even still today, women make 15% of men than for doing the same job. So those are big. Those are kind of 3 or 4 big areas. But one of the biggest areas, 2 other big areas, investing in workforce development. Like, workforce development is because if it's somebody walking on the street, or if it's a business owner, I always ask, what's your biggest concern or biggest issue, and then asking why is that a problem? Like, for me, I'm a problem solver. I'm an analyst, and I kind of do the 5 why drill down. Well, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? To get a better understanding of both the scale and scope of the problem. And a lot of it has to do with workforce development, and being able to recruit, retain, train, and resource our folks so we can, build the next generation submarine, so we can build the next generation windmill, build the next generation semiconductor. And a lot of those big businesses will attract small businesses as well. So that's a big thing.
Is that a public education problem? And
it is.
Technical training, or what?
Big time. It is, because I mean, having the opportunity to interact with so many different countries around the world, and understanding not only our allies and friends, but also our competitors and our adversaries. In the case of China, they're teaching their 9th graders quantum physics while we're teaching ours algebra, right? And so if we want, we have to have the end goal in mind. What are those 21st century jobs that we need? Thinking of AI and quantum physics and all the things that are critical to competing and being able to maintain our competitive edge, and then backtrack and say, all right, what kinds of knowledge, skills, and abilities do we need as a workforce? And then backtracking that, right? Okay, in high school, like there's technical training schools, there's high school, there's middle school, there's and so it starts early, and I think government has a role in helping shaping that, not to the very minute detail level, and telling exactly what you should teach and how you should teach it, but I think there's a level of, we got to make sure we're teaching the right things in the right ways to meet the 21st century jobs. The other big thing that's really hampering our ability to grow our economy here locally is just housing and affordable housing. Whether it's folks I talk to in Woonsocket or Newport or Providence or Bristol or Barrington. I mean, small businesses, restaurants, folks are traveling hour and a half because there's no affordable housing for workers to be in. So that's a big thing. And I think, and then this is where really my background experience over the last 20 years in my work on climate change, and helping our coastal communities better mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there's, bringing clean energy jobs to Rhode Island. There's reducing greenhouse emissions, and at the end of the day, protecting our, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the land we walk on. Those are, my 3 big core focus areas. And my work over the last, the last 15, 16 years on climate change, I'm ready to hit the ground running on it, and we'll, continue to lead in that effort in Congress, because there's not a lot of folks in Congress who have the background, experience, expertise on climate change issues, and probably 1 or 2, and they're from Maine and Alaska, that actually have any expertise on Arctic issues, which You know, the Arctic is ground zero to climate change. You know, it's warming 4 times the rate as anywhere else in the world. So, yeah, those are my three big priorities are rising costs, rising division, and rising seas. And the rising division part, I mean, we won't be able to fix any of our problems unless we change our politics. You know, unless we, like the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome. I mean, if we continue to elect leaders, political insiders and folks who are, who have the means themselves, who are millionaires, then I think we're going to get the same kinds of outcomes. But if we elect working class folks who understand the struggles and understand the challenges that everyday Rhode Islanders are going through, but also have the experience and expertise in serving in a lot of the big key areas that we need to focus on, both as a country, but also in our communities. I think that's at least what I would want out of a representative, and that's why I jumped in this race.
Great.
So a lot of those talking points, or not talking points, but a lot of the things that you care about as priorities, I think, land well with this group, the people in this room, small business owner, myself and probably Ethan all would agree with you and on those issues being of critical importance. You're running to try and win a Democratic primary where often the headline issues are not things like that. They're often abortion rights,
mm-hmm.
healthcare, women's rights,
sure.
More traditional social issues, and certainly democratic social issues.
Sure.
So how do you think you stand up in those areas in terms of knowledge and command of the issues and positions, and how do you see yourself, especially against this field, where there's some candidates for whom this is, these are leading issues.
Right. Yeah, and they are, in terms of rising division, right? I would bucket those areas that you mentioned in there, because it's really kind of the last few years, 4, 5, 6 years, really since I think Trump that was a whole other story, which we could talk about. But since he took office, I mean, just the level of extremist ideologies and folks that are just ripping away the very freedoms and values that I spent the last 2 decades defending is only increasing. And I mean, on the topic of abortion, on women's reproductive freedoms, I can't tell you how many, parents, students, or women in general who have expressed just their very real fears and frustrations, and the fact that my daughter has less rights than her mother, and I've been very clear about this in the past. I will not stop fighting until our daughters and granddaughters have the same rights, reproductive freedoms as their mothers and grandmothers. And it actually infuriates me, and I'm kind of boiling up right now because of how just ridiculous it is. And it doesn't have to be like this. It shouldn't be like this. But this is what happens when, we allow these extremist ideologies to take hold of portions of our society, and we as citizens, elect leaders who either are part of that thinking or don't have the courage to fight against it. So pro-choice unequivocally without any conditions, because because every situation is so different. I mean, I read a story from a woman in Texas not too long ago who had, that because there was still a heartbeat, even in her late-term pregnancy, that she couldn't get an abortion, even though she had a life-threatening condition. And that resulted in her being in the ICU fighting for her life for 3 days, and she made it. But it shouldn't even gone that far. But the fact that laws are the laws, and I think on the topic of firearms and assault weapons, as a veteran, I understand the responsibilities that come with handling firearms, both handguns, assault weapons. I've been trained in both. But I also know firsthand like the real risks and consequences of them. And assault weapons have no place on our streets. I mean, they belong on our battlefield. They're designed for battlefield engagement. And I won't stop fighting in Congress until we pass common sense gun legislation that does a few things. I think it requires extensive background checks. It requires red flag laws to make sure that we keep those guns out of the hands of those who shouldn't have them. Making more significant investments in research to better understand how to prevent gun violence. That's another key one. And we can adopt some key laws from other countries, license, registration, proof of insurance, right? And then in order to get those three things, you gotta do just like you would like a driving test, right? You gotta get trained, you gotta pass it, and then a health screening. And I think you look at countries like Israel, Australia, Japan, folks who have implemented some of these laws, but also increase the purchase of any firearm to the age of 21. And then finally, which is the most the most consequential part is banning assault weapons and high capacity magazines, because like I said, assault weapons, I mean, they don't have a place on our streets, in my opinion.
How do you define an assault weapon?
I mean, semi-automatic and automatic assault. I mean, automatics are already banned, but your AR-15s. There's, and I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment, but it's a right to, folks do have a right to bear arms, but there's also the other part that people fail to mention is a well-regulated militia, and you can still have, the right to self-defense, but I don't see a need for assault weapons, and from that perspective.
Switching to this particular race and some of the other candidates, can you talk about how you view Sabina Mattos's, not what happened, but particularly how she responded and how that might relate to her ability to service in Congress?
Yeah, I've been pretty vocal about this because it's important, because it's a matter of judgment, it's a matter of character, it's a matter of integrity, and I told when this broke, I had my team, we came together, and I'm like, look, let this be a learning situation for all of us. Like, had this happen to us, the first thing we do, and I would have got ahead of it, me personally, because it gets down to it gets down to leadership. It's about honesty, it's about communicating, it's about doing the right thing, and it's about getting ahead of the problem and saying, look, we've been aware of the situation, these are the facts, and at the end of the day, it is your team, your name is on the ballot, nobody else's, everybody works for you, and so you have to, as a leader, you have to be willing to trust your people to make the right decisions, but you also have to be willing to accept responsibility for those decisions. And she didn't do that. It took her a week to communicate to the general public, and then she continued to, push the buck off to everyone else. And then I think it was at the Rhode Island Roger Williams where, I think it was at that debate, where she's like, no, I took responsibility. No, you didn't. You did not take responsibility. So that was a lie. And then, this last week where she did her press conference and brought out Nick Adiello, I thought, again, that's lack of integrity, lack of judgment, lack of character, because if you really want to promote and strengthen and defend democracy, you shouldn't deter and dissuade voters from voting for who they want to vote for. Right. So to me, that's like 2 strikes. And it's important that we have, leaders who are going to be honest and who are going to communicate with you, who are going to listen to you, and who are going to fight for you whether you voted for them or not. And And I think that's what we need in Washington, is just people who can put country first, who could put who could put the needs and interest of the people over any party, or over politics. And that's why I'm running, and that's what I've done my entire career, and that's what I'll continue to do, in Congress.
So, I guess you've talked to this maybe a little bit. That one of my big questions is always why. Why are you doing this? You kind of touched on it in the beginning, but if you don't get through this primary, where do you go from here? Do you feel like you've turned a corner in a new direction with your career and life, or and you're going to go in a different direction, or do you think you sort of go back to what you're been?
To me, even with this, almost every decision that I've made throughout my career is all just kind of answering the call. Wherever I feel that I can best serve, and whether that's in this role or a different role or returning back to what I was doing, I honestly don't know. I'll think about it when I cross that bridge. But for me, it's just that continuation of serving and doing what's right and trying to be in this case a voice for the voiceless, and in some ways give hope to the hopeless, because there's so many people out there that just are so discouraged and so fearful of our future, and it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. Growing up in my family's restaurant really shaped me, but growing up, with the military, and growing up at the federal level as a civil servant, where, unlike some of my opponents, one of my opponents, I'm not a political appointee that worked for a specific administration. As a civil servant, you take an oath, and you work on behalf of the American people, regardless of president. And I think that's what we need, is someone who understands both sides and can work with both sides to to bring people together, to reach common ground for the common good, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. We have to compromise and make small incremental progress to get to the bigger goal. Like, we're not going to solve climate change overnight, but we can have little wins and eventually get there.
You might say the candidates for this office, this position, ideologically, forget about style and character, are very similar. Would you define yourself as the most conservative of the group? Where do you see yourself on the spectrum? What kind of Democrat are you?
God, I've been asked this obviously for the last few months, and it's been a real challenge for me, because I've never, to me, I'm an American first and a Democrat second, and that's how I've always viewed myself. So where I fit on the ideological scale.
I asked that because of what you just said about the two parties and bringing. I'm a moderate at the end of the day. I grew up a Kennedy Democrat, and I think we just don't have enough people in Congress who are willing to have conversations, to listen, and to bring people together. But there are people in Congress who do that today. And I know of a few of them, and they're veterans on both sides of the aisle, and there's others who aren't veterans. But I would say I'm a moderate Democrat who can see both sides, and that's exactly what I've done my entire career. Is you gotta get everybody in the same room. You've gotta provide people the opportunity to make their voice heard, and at the end of the day, reach consensus and common ground. As hard as it's going to be, you gotta do it for the better of the country. Good.
But one of the I don't even think I've mentioned it yet, but one of the most gratifying ways I've been able to serve is through the Red Cross here in Rhode Island. I've done that for 7-8 years. Providing food and shelter to residents in Newport, but then also during COVID, was asked by the the executive director, Susan, to lead the Red Cross's vaccination support efforts in conjunction with the local and state leaders, which was one of the most gratifying ways to serve. I mean, folks, you know, we had vaccination sites in Providence, Pawtucket, and you know, it's really cool to just see, you know, the best in people come out in the worst in times. But it's truly just an amazing organization with an amazing mission. And there's over 3,000 volunteers across Rhode Island that roll up their sleeves each and every day to help, you know, respond to fires, you know, to install free smoke alarms, to, you know, disasters like the one in Newport and, you know, during COVID. So just a Red Cross plug in there for the folks who are interested. Yeah.
I had another question. I just lost it as you were.
My time is yours.
As you were talking about disasters, I got distracted. I'm sorry.
I can answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
We were interviewing somebody and they said something interesting about Congress. It was essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically to get stuff done and to have people listen to you there, you need to either have expertise or experience, basically tenure or be really good at something. And if you're elected, you would be the, you know, obviously the newest and sort of smallest fish in a really big pond. So what would you say your expertise is? Because the experience ain't gonna be there.
Well,
as you self-admit,
experience and as from a
congressional
legislative,
yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
But I can hit the ground running and hold my own, you know, easily on committees like, you know, Foreign Relations Committee, House Intel Committee, Armed Services Committee. Like those are all like the no-brainers for me. But I would be absolutely honored to serve on any of those because they're all very important. But I'm really focused on, and I mentioned it earlier, like helping solve one of the biggest problems that we have in our country and our communities, and that's housing. And so being able to be on the subcommittee and eventually chair on that housing committee would be amazing, because I think that's where you can really help shape national level policies and bring resources down to the local
level. What if anything has surprised you during the campaign, good or bad? You know, you've never been through this, you've never experienced it, it's your first time through. Any surprising highs or lows in the last few months?
This system is not built for everyone. I mean, that's one thing I've learned. I mean, if you're not super connected or super wealthy, you know, you're not getting on TV. You know, it is really hard to raise money as grassroots, but I'm super proud of how successful we've been so far. I mean, almost 200,000 in 4 months with just, you know, grassroots. So that, I knew it was going to be hard, but an off-cycle special election, you know, not that hard. I'm also somewhat surprised and really disturbed by, and I talked a little bit about this with Gregor Maury, just people just don't know this election is even going on, right? And that's where, you know, your service is huge, because people need to know, like, it's going on. Here are your options, and you figure out who you want to represent you in the future. And I think, you know, going into Congress, one of the big things that I would focus on is just earmarking money for communities to promote elections, especially special elections, right? I mean, we have plenty of money in different ways to promote, you know, market different things, but to promote and market elections is, you know, the backbone of our democracy. So we got to help promote it and preserve it. So that's something that's been surprising. But one of the hardest things is just being away from the family as much, you know, being away from the kids and the wife.
Have you been knocking on doors?
Yeah, I mean, you don't see these shoes?
I've been looking at those shoes.
Actually, I had to stop walking in these shoes because they were like hurt. So I got in my Brooks and started wearing those out even more. Yeah, I mean, me personally, is like, you know, even for the signatures, which, you know, I collected over 500 myself and challenged my team to match, and we did. We have an incredible team, and but I think we've called over 3,000 folks, and I think we're close to 1,000 doors.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're not, again, we didn't have the money for, we could have spent the money on things like a TV buy, or could have spent it on, but we were very strategic and smart about how we spend our money. So we did all direct mailers to folks who are a Democrat or unregistered, and being smart about how we spend it on social media, particularly in Facebook, which is, we did a big ad buy this past week. And door knocking, good old-fashioned door knocking. But I mean, the sense is, look, I mean, this is a wide open race, regardless of the internal polls and PR stunts that folks want to play. It really is a wide open race. I mean, I was door knocking in Bristol.
And because so few people are going to vote.
Yeah, I was door knocking in Bristol 2 days ago, and I dropped a bunch of flyers and I knocked on about 6 doors, and three out of the 6 I opened, they're like, just keep your flyer, we already voted for you. I was like, great. But it's just, you just don't know.
Right.
And anything can happen in a race like this, especially because a lot of folks are really hyper focused on those, super Democrat voters. But there's a lot of unregistered, and there's a lot of independents who can sway an election like this.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that, being a moderate Democrat, that they'll see me appealing.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to touch on before we sign off?
We can go all day.
Well, anything else we haven't talked about that you want to get into, or that's important to you?
I think we hit on the economy piece and how divisive we are, and how the impacts of climate change. I think at the end of the day, we just need leaders who can put country first, who can put the needs and interests of people first, and not party or their own personal or career ambitions. Or like for me, it was really hard to walk away from a very stable, financially stable job, but also, I mean, I was about to get tenured, about to get promoted.
Wow.
Right, I literally just submitted my package for promotion and tenure, which would have sailed through. But I was like, look, the fire in my belly wants to continue serving in a different way, and an opportunity like this doesn't come around often, and we just got to make sure we get the right person in there, because this is a once in a generational opportunity, and we just got to make sure we get the right person in there to represent us and serve us and fight for us.
Good for you. Thank you for doing it.
Appreciate you.
Can I ask my cheesy question?
Did you say cheesy?
Yeah, I always have a cheesy, humanizing question for people.
Yeah.
And I like your perspective on it, being a military guy. And you mentioned country first, and sort of these themes of wanting to serve America. I think that we've sort of seen a trend in the past 7 or 8 years of a kind of, I call it sort of like toxic patriotism, which is almost leaning on the side of this nationalistic tendency to
100%.
Country's 100% right all the time. If you go against it, you're anti-American. So I was curious what your definition of patriotism is and how you fulfill that.
At the end of the day, it's like, especially in this day and age, like we shouldn't be judged by how much we have in our bank accounts or the reach of our Twitter following, but the growth of our people. And it's just if we're at the end of the day, I think if people are it's a balance, right? But it's being able to put the needs and interests of people first. And that's what I mean by putting country first, is just you have to put the needs and interests of people first, and regardless of how hard it might be to go against the grain and go against I think JFK was a good example. John McCain did it as well. Liz Cheney more recently. I mean, there are people in Congress who can speak their voice, even though it's different. And I mentioned it before with, being able to reduce the defense budget and being one of maybe 2 folks in Congress, if I were serving today, to vote against the NDAA, because it just fundamentally doesn't address the most urgent problem, which is Russia and Ukraine, and the more long-term pacing threat, which is China. And so we can't do everything and everywhere, but that requires us to prioritize and make really hard decisions. And that's what you have to do in Congress. But it's about, at the end of the day, it's putting the needs and interests of the people first, and it's number one is the safety and security of the American people, and two is making sure there's equal opportunity to, you know, to put food on the table and thrive and make this, you know, the best community and country that we can have.
Appreciate it.
Great. Good job.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Easy. Just